Joining us now is Paul Manafort, former Trump campaign manager. He helped manage Ford's 1976 convention battle, which is relevant considering what may be happening down the road. Paul, good to see you tonight. Voters may not even get the opportunity to put Biden in for another 4 years, right? The Democrats still do have a chance to dump him at the convention, especially after, the Hur report and his performance since. What would happen if Democrats ended up with this type of contested convention?
Well, it would be a long shot situation, Laura. The Democrats, the Republicans actually have a rule that delegates elected for the Republican nominee in the primaries and caucuses have to vote on the first ballot for whoever they were pledged to. The Democrats don't have that. They have a sort of tacit pledge, but not a binding commitment for the delegates to vote in support of whoever they represented in the primaries or caucuses. So it's conceivable, but it's unlikely. The reality is the president controls all the mechanisms of power. You saw what he did when he knocked Iowa out as first in the nation and then been demoted New Hampshire as first primary and put South Carolina first in their nominating process because he looked at that as rewarding his base. That's the kind of control he has. And he controls the Democratic National Committee as well, which sets the temporary rules for the convention and can actually make the delegates bound as. So they've got options, but it's unlikely that Biden would be wouldn't be the nominee. However, there is an interesting thought that I was thinking about. That doesn't mean they have to support the Vice President Harris. They're not pledged to her.
Yeah, explain that because Paul, a lot of people have come up to me and said, well, first of all, is Joe going to make it? And I said, he's the most stubborn man in Washington. Paul, you've known him for a long time. He's one of the most stubborn people in Washington. The idea that he would ever voluntarily step aside is hysterically funny to me. But it doesn't have to be Kamala. Why? Explain that.
Well, because the delegates that are being elected are Biden delegates. Now, in theory, a Biden delegate should be a Harris delegate, but they're not bound to Harris. And so the convention could nominate somebody from the floor to challenge Harris, even if Biden is still supporting her. What would happen in that situation? I don't know. I mean, we know that the Democrats don't want Biden or Harris as their nominees, but they can't stop Joe Biden. They might be able to cause a problem for Harris, which would, of course, be a major problem for Biden. He'd have to put his whole floor operation together to ensure that she won if she were challenged on the floor. And they'll play with the rules and do everything they can to avoid that. But that's where the risk is to a Biden-Harris ticket. It's on the VP situation.
Well, the problem, Paul, is that when people say, well, where Republicans argue, like, remember, a vote for Joe is a vote for Kamala. And the Democrats don't really love her either. If all the reporting out there is correct. No. They know she's a problem, but she's a first. Yeah. So as I said in the Angle, you can't hopscotch her and go to Mr. Brill Cream over there in California. That's not going to be possible.
Well, the media says that it's hard for Biden to do that, but the delegates are a different story. And so I would not be surprised to start to see some groundswell when they finally come to the realization in the media and with the Democrat establishment that they're not going to get Joe Biden to retire. It's just not going to happen. And so if the fear is that Biden is too old and Harris is incompetent, then maybe remove the incompetent could make Biden more palatable. That would be the theory. Frankly, Paul, I don't think that works either.
Yeah. But, Paul, do you agree that Biden is one of the most stubborn politicians in Washington? And Absolutely. He's never going to step aside. I just don't see that at all.
Not only is he stubborn, I mean, he doesn't know anything else. He's been in government his entire life. And so, why does he care if he's too old? I mean, he doesn't have anything else, and doesn't want to retire. And he's the last person who's going to say, "I'm going to walk away from Donald Trump. I'm not going to look afraid of Donald Trump." So, I mean, there's just nothing that's going to cause Biden or Jill Biden to have him retire from the race at any point in time. And
Paul,
the convention will not unseat him.
Yeah, who do you think is really running the White House? Is it just a group of people, or?
Well, the problem is I don't know if anybody's running the White House. I think you've got little fiefdoms there where people who are close to Obama and part of the Obama network are moving their pet issues, whether it's in foreign policy or climate change or anything like that. But the problem is, as you said in your opening monologue, nobody's in charge. There is no coherent message. And so you've got all these staff people, and even the cabinet members are included in what I call staff, because that's a level of competence, are performing in ways that are not really linked. I mean, one of the things I noticed it last week, if you remember when Maduro sidelined his main opponent in Venezuela in the presidential election. The White House actually released a statement saying that it's a banana republic that doesn't allow the major opponent to the president to run in an election campaign.
Right. They don't even get what they're saying.
They don't connect the dots.
No.
They don't
Paul,
connect the dots.
Paul, great to see you tonight. Invaluable insight. Thank you.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.